Hello everyone. Welcome to Ready, Set, Go, a webinar series sponsored by HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, known as SNAPS. My name is Kate Lyons and I'm with ICF International, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. On behalf of SNAPS, I would like to thank all of you for joining us. Today's webinar is Using IDIS Online for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. We are lucky to have two national experts presenting today. Kevin Kissinger is the team leader for technical assistance at HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs. He is also on the Emergency Solutions Grants Program team, specializing in IDIS and the Consolidated Plan. Chris Pitcher is a senior analyst at the Cloudburst Group. He has more than 10 years of experience in COC and HMIS implementation, data management, and analysis using IDIS. He is also the technical assistance lead on the development of IDIS guidance for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour and is being recorded. The webinar recording will be posted within a week on the HUD HRE website at www.hudhre.info. You should have received a link that you can go into the HUD HRE and download these slides. This link was sent to you just about an hour ago as a reminder email. Due to the large number of participants, your microphone will be automatically muted for the duration of the call. Next slide, please. We recommend using your phone to listen in and not your computer speakers. If you experience any technical difficulties, please request assistance by going to the GoToWebinar toolbar and clicking Questions. We will get back to you as soon as possible. Next slide, please. We will not be answering live questions today. If you have an ESG-specific question that is not addressed during the webinar, submit it to HUD's IDIS Technical Assistance Unit. The phone number is 1-877-483-8282. Yeah. The email is idis.help@hud.gov. Please reference this presentation, Using IDIS Online for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program, in your questions. After the webinar today, a brief feedback survey will be emailed to you. Please respond to this evaluation. The information is reviewed and informs the delivery of future webinars. Poll questions will be asked throughout the webinar to test the knowledge of participants. We encourage you to participate as they help give us a sense of how the webinar is going. As a reminder, you will remain muted throughout the call. Next slide, please. Upon completion of this webinar, participants will be able to correctly set up the ESG project and up to 6 ESG activities, including the proper naming conventions that HUD requires. Participants will also be able to fund ESG activities and select the subrecipient organizations that receive funding under each qualified activity. Participants will also be able to draw ESG funds by activity and subrecipient organization. Next slide, please. The topics covered in this webinar are an introduction on the use of IDIS Online for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program, proper ESG project and activity setup protocols that differ significantly from the Emergency Shelter Grants Program procedures, new administration subfund procedures and new activity funding procedures that require recipients to select the subrecipient organization that receives funding for qualified activities. Also, new ESG drawdown procedures that require subrecipient organization designation during the drawdown process. Finally, we will discuss special instructions for 2011 that arose because there were 2 allocations of ESG, known as the first and second allocations. In future years, there will not be 2 allocations, so these conditions will only arise this year. This presentation uses the acronym ESG to refer to the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. Reference to the Emergency Shelter Grants Program will be spoken or spelled out fully. Now I'd like to turn it over to Kevin Kissinger from HUD SNAPS office. Next slide.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kevin. I just want to repeat for those of you that were logging in late where you can find a copy of this PowerPoint presentation so you don't have to use 3 notebook pads to take notes with the detailed information we're presenting. If you go to the HUD Homelessness Resource Exchange at www.hudhre.info, and then at the top you'll see a banner where it says Find a Resource. If you click on Find a Resource and select ESG, it will take you to the ESG homepage. And on that, there's going to be a list of several things, including webinars. Click on the webinar link, and it will take you to all the webinars we've delivered. And one of those webinars is today's webinar, and what you'll see there is the slides. So you can look at those online, or you can print them out and take notes as we go along. I just want to mention this is a detailed presentation, and we do currently have instructions posted for IDIS and the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. Those were posted in November, and there will be an update posted relatively soon to include a couple of the new features we're talking about today. So hopefully those will be up by next week. So almost everything in this presentation is in the guidance. So between the guidance and the slides, you should have everything you need. So first we're going to begin now with our introduction to IDIS for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. An entirely new path has been created for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program in IDIS called HESG. The acronym HESG stands for Hearth ESG. HUD created the HESG program path in IDIS to delineate between the Emergency Solutions Grant Program in IDIS and the Emergency Shelter Grants Program in IDIS. Since these two programs have different regulations and requirements, HUD needed to create 2 program paths, and unfortunately we couldn't use the same acronym ESG for both paths. So the new program still has the acronym ESG, just like the old program, but we're just using HESG to refer to the program path in IDIS. So once ESG, always ESG. Next slide, please. So this webinar is designed to explain how to set up an ESG project and its activities in IDIS correctly, as well as draw down ESG funds. It's not intended to be an IDIS 101 training. We're assuming that you and our audience have at least a basic understanding of IDIS and its basic function. Many of the items we'll discuss relate to the recently released interim rule for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. If you've not attended previous ESG webinars in the last few weeks, a few of the terms and ideas presented here may be new to you. So in that webinar link I gave you earlier are many of the other webinars we've delivered for ESG, so make sure you're consulting that as needed. At the current time, you may have both Emergency Shelter Grant and Emergency Solutions Grant funding active in your community. It's extremely important that for federal fiscal year 2010 ESG funds and prior, that you use the ESG path in IDIS. You should not be using the ESG path in IDS for Emergency Solutions Grant Programs, activities, projects, or draws. Stated another way, all FY fiscal year 2011 Emergency Solutions Grant Program funds must be set up, funded, and drawn using only the HESG program path. We've had a few instances of grantees going into the old path and not being able to find their money, or setting up something under HESG but then associated with something else in ESG, and it gets very confusing. So you can only use 2011 ESG funds within the HESG program path. And at HUD headquarters, we've been monitoring project and activity setup under the HESG program path. And if we see something that's slightly amiss, we'll be contacting you to let you know that something's incorrect. For instance, we've seen people create an activity in the correct program path, but then associate it with an old project from 2010 in the ESG program path. Ideally, IDS doesn't allow you to do those things, but unfortunately it does, so you just want to be very, very careful. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, the Emergency Solutions Grant Program has new regulations and requirements, so HUD created the HESG program path to best align with the new program. And that new program better aligns with the strategies cities, counties, and states that are receiving ESG funds use to prevent and end homelessness. These are the strategies reflected in the new consolidated plan requirements and the ESG interim rule. And we had a webinar, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, discussing, was that a pun? Discussing those changes. These changes also ensure that the new program best aligns with the continuum of care strategies and align more effectively with HUD's strategic plan and the federal strategic plan to end homelessness, called Open Doors. In addition, much of what we're talking about today in the new program path will help improve financial data and reporting, which HUD, ESG recipients, and others, such as members of the continuum of care, can use for analyzing how ESG funds are used at the local level. We'll talk a lot about this later. Next slide, please. ESG recipients are those entities of state and local government that receive direct entitlement ESG funds from HUD. The ESG recipient, we used to call them the ESG grantee, uses IDIS to track financial aspects of the program. This includes setting up one ESG project per federal fiscal year, setting up to 6 ESG activities, funding those activities, and selecting the subrecipient organizations that will be carrying out those activities, drawing ESG funds by the activity, and indicating which subrecipient organization that draw is ultimately going to, and finally running financial reports for monitoring purposes using MicroStrategies, which is a reporting platform used by IDIS. I think most of you are familiar with IDIS reports, so that platform has not changed. You may see a couple new things there in terms of indicating the subrecipients that will be receiving that will be receiving ESG funds, and also when you're doing your draws, indicating the subrecipients. So we'll talk about that, but those are two things that are new. One other thing that's new, and in 99% for the recipients that receive ESG, this isn't an issue, but ESG subrecipients are no longer allowed to access IDIS for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. Only the recipient that directly receives funds from HUD, the grantee that we used to call them, will be able to access IDIS. At this time, ESG recipients are not going to be using IDIS to collect and report beneficiary data. That might change, but at this point, data collection is not taking place in IDIS. There's a lot of things going on here at HUD, such as the consolidated plan being put into IDIS. There will be some sort of, reporting required, but right now that's not in IDIS. Next slide, please. This next diagram shows how the process that I briefly went over in the previous slide really works on a more programmatic level. So let me just go over this a little bit. What we're calling level 1 here is when you, as the city or county or state, receive your Emergency Solutions Grant Program allocation. So let's just say for FY11 you received your allocation. You will then in ESG be setting up one project and one project only that corresponds to that year's allocation. And the next thing we're going to do is Chris is going to show you how to do that. After that one project is set up that corresponds to the allocation, you'll be able to carry out what you've said you're going to do with ESG in your action plan and make sure that's reflected in IDIS. So the eligible components of ESG, for example, street outreach, shelter, rapid rehousing, those eligible components which correspond to strategies to prevent or end homelessness are reflected in IDIS at the activity level. So you'll have the ability to set up to 6 Emergency Solutions Grant activity a year that correspond to that one project. So we'll go over that, and I'll be going over that in detail right after Chris talks about setting up a project. Level 3 is where things start changing a little bit more than they have before. This is where programmatically you now have subcontracts with your subrecipient organizations. You know who's going to be getting ESG funds for the year. The way that's reflected in IDIS is when you go to set up the activity, you're going to be indicating all the subrecipient organizations that you expect will be receiving these ESG funds. Now that can change, and you can always go back in and revise, go back into activity setup and change that. But the idea is that HUD knows up front who you anticipate or who you know for sure will be getting, which subrecipients will be getting those ESG funds. So at that point, you're notifying the subrecipients that when they make requests for draws, that they're very clear of what fiscal year allocation, they're asking to draw from and which activity category. At level 4, then, the subrecipients in your program will be requesting reimbursement for eligible costs. You're going to want to be making sure as a state, territory, city, or county that receives ESG that your books show that you know exactly which activity category you need to be drawing for this subrecipient. So when you do the drawdown, it's now going to ask you what subrecipient are you drawing down for. And it theoretically is only going to give you those that you indicated at level 3 when you set up the activity. So if I said that that I had 2 organizations where I was going to be giving funds to for FY11 for street outreach, at the draw level then, if I went to draw for a street outreach activity, I should only be able to pick from those 2 organizations. So at this point, HUD, field offices, and other people, once IDIS starts having some different reports of this program, will be able to tell very easily who this money is going to. All right, so that's a broad overview. We wanted to show you how what goes in IDIS relates to what happens in your program. So let's go to the next slide now, please. Okay, before I turn things over to Kate for our first polling question, I want to mention that the new program continues to track draw requirements by the federal fiscal year in which the ESG funds were allocated. So in other words, regardless of your individual program year, for IDIS, the year associated with each project and activity must be associated with the federal fiscal year for which an ESG recipient's funding was allocated. If your program year is different, then we do have some naming conventions, which we'll talk about later, so you'll be able to see that very easily in the report for both naming projects and activities, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. But now, since you're waiting with bated breath, I'm going to turn it back over to Kate for the first polling question.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, we're not even 20 minutes in, and we've got a lot of information already. So this is our first poll of many. Please go ahead and answer. We appreciate that. I'll give you a few minutes. Okay, a lot of people have answered. So there we go. Okay, at least 2/3 of you have answered already. So who is required to enter ESG information into IDIS? The correct answer is C. Emergency Solutions Grants recipients are required by statute to use IDIS to manage the financial aspects of the ESG program. Though only the recipient is required and allowed to enter information in IDIS, it is highly encouraged that the recipient work with the COC and local HMIS staff to report about ESG and similar activities at the local community level. This will strengthen the community's understanding of the services that ESG supports and their effectiveness at preventing or ending homelessness. So 82% got it right. That's fantastic. I'd like to now hand it over to Chris Pitcher from the Cloudburst Group.
Thanks, Kate. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to next talk about the process for properly setting up an ESG project in IDIS. You'll note I said project and not projects, as there is only one project that needs to be set up for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program per year. Next slide. In IDIS, the ESG project represents the annual ESG funding allocation and the recipient directly receiving ESG funds from HUD. Recipients should only set up one ESG project per federal fiscal year. IDIS will restrict a recipient from setting up more than one ESG project per year. IDIS projects link ESG activities to a recipient's annual action plan for a specific program year. Once the project is established, the recipient will set up an activity for each of the eligible ESG activity categories. For example, an ESG rapid rehousing activity can link to an ESG recipient strategy to prevent homelessness. Next slide. Before we get into the specifics of how to set up an ESG project, we want to show you this diagram, which depicts how the ESG project and activities are related in the new HESG program path in IDIS. The diagram also shows how the IDIS project and activity structure are related to the ESG interim regulation. Remember that each project has associated activities undertaken for each year. Here you can see illustrated that the ESG project activity structure and naming conventions within IDIS. ESG recipients can only set up one ESG project per year in IDIS. In IDIS, the ESG project represents the annual ESG funding allocation and the recipient directly receiving funds from HUD. After an ESG recipient sets up its project for that year, it can then create up to 6 activities. These activities represent eligible program components that ESG recipients can use to support local strategies and actions in their consolidated plan to prevent and end homelessness. Kevin will review this a little bit later in more detail. IDIS does not allow you to set up more than one project or more than one of each of the 6 different activities within IDIS. Also, you can see that there is a project and activity structure is significantly different from the Emergency Shelter Grants program. Therefore, you will need to train your staff who work in IDIS so that they fully understand the new conventions. Next slide. When you first go to create a project, you will need to access the Add Project screen. This slide illustrates the first half of the Add Project screen, and you'll notice that we have circled 3 fields that I will emphasize in a moment. This single screen is the only one that must be completed to set up the ESG project in IDIS. Please remember that there can only be one ESG project per year and that the project represents the entire ESG grant. You'll want to ensure that you enter all required information, including entering the entire ESG grant amount in the HESG line that we'll show you in a few slides. Remember to save your changes before navigating from this or any screen within IDIS. If you don't click Save, your work will be lost. Next slide. This is the second half of the Add Project screen that began on the last slide. As you can see here, we have circled 3 more fields that are important and will be explained in more detail in the following slides. Again, this is the Add Project screen, which is the single screen that must be completed to set up the ESG project in IDIS. Next slide. Select the appropriate year from the Program Year drop-down menu. That field is the first one we circled on the previous screenshot. Remember, for the field entitled Program Year, you select the federal fiscal year for which you were allocated ESG funds. So for the first year of the Emergency Solutions Grant Program, you would select 2011. You should not have to select the Add New Program Year field, since the year 2011 has most likely already been created earlier for other programs in IDIS. For future years, if the program year you are going to use is not yet available on the drop-down menu, you will need to add a new program year, which we will not cover in detail in this webinar. The program year corresponds to the 1-year annual action plan within the consolidated plan. The program year links an ESG project in IDIS to its associated IDS activities for the initial funding year. Accurately linking projects and activities to the correct program year is vital to tracking a recipient's compliance with commitments and expenditure requirements. For most recipients, the program year in IDIS corresponds to the federal fiscal year of the ESG allegation. However, if the program year does not correspond with the federal fiscal year, the recipient should use the local program year in the name of the project that we will explain in a few slides. Next slide. Next, you'll enter a project title that conforms to the ESG project naming convention. The required naming convention for all ESG projects is to use the program, ESG, followed by the 2-digit federal fiscal year, and then the recipient's name. For example, ESG 11 space HUDville. Note that the naming convention includes a space between ESG 11 and the recipient name. For program years beyond 2011, substitute 11 for the appropriate 2-digit year. If the recipient's program year is different from HUD's federal fiscal year, place that in parentheses after the recipient name. For example, ESG 11 space HUDville parentheses 2012. This is for local recipient purposes only and will not be used by HUD. Recipients may choose to assign a grantee PJ project ID, which is optional. This ID is only for the recipient's use and will not be used by HUD. Next slide. ESG recipients should also enter a brief project description in the narrative field that includes the eligible categories the ESG recipient plans to fund, such as street outreach or rapid rehousing. These categories are listed on the diagram we showed earlier. We'll look at it again when we explain how to set up ESG activities in IDIS. An example narrative might be, HUDville's 2011 ESG funds will be used to provide outreach to persons living on the street, operate a shelter for the homeless, provide emergency rental assistance to prevent homelessness, implement rapid rehousing strategies, and for program administration and data collection through HMIS. This description should be thorough enough that the reader is able to understand the strategies that your jurisdiction undertakes as part of ESG. Since the consolidated plan is being put into IDIS, project descriptions become more important for IDS reports and linkages to the consolidated plan. Again, make the description succinct and usable so that citizens reviewing your consolidated plan can understand how the recipient is utilizing the various program components of ESG to prevent and end homelessness in the local community. Next slide. Only ESG recipients can access IDIS. Therefore, do not select the next two options that appear on the screen. Do not click on Allow another organization to set up activities under this project, since no other organizations should set up activities or draw ESG funds directly in IDIS. This option is scheduled to be disabled in the December 2011 IDIS release, but it is active now. Also, do not click on Select Sponsor Organization under the Assigned Sponsor for this project only for HOPWA or HOPWA-C programs, as this feature is not used for the ESG program. This option is also scheduled to be disabled in the December 2011 IDIS release. Finally, make sure that the estimated amount that you enter in the HESG row is for the entire amount of the 2011 ESG allocation, which we will describe in more detail on the next slide. This slide shows the bottom of the Add Project screen and focuses on the estimated funding. It is important that you enter the estimated amount of ESG funds for the proper program year under the appropriate HESG row. Because only a single ESG project is to be set up for each program year, this should equal the total amount or the HUD authorized amount. Remember that recipients commit ESG funds to activities and not the project. Please note, for the 2001 federal fiscal year, revise this amount to include the combined total of the first and second allocations of ESG. Beyond 2011, enter the entire amount of the ESG funds received, as there will not be two separate allocations. Do not enter a grant amount for the ESG row. If funds are entered in the ESG row, you will be able to proceed, but reporting will not be correct. It will appear that you have set up more than one ESG project in the HESG path, which is not allowed. If you've done this in your previous setup of first allocation ESG funds, you probably received a call from a TA provider to help you fix the issue. To be proactive, if you made this mistake, simply go in and edit the project and move the funding from the ESG row to the HGSG row. I will now hand the presentation back to Kevin.
All right, thank you, Chris. We're 1/3 through the presentation, so let's give a yeehaw. So 2/3 to go. We'll see if we can do it in 30 minutes. All right, now we're going to talk about the instructions for properly setting up ESG activities in IDIS. Next slide, please. Before we get into the specifics, I wanted to go back to the diagram that Chris presented earlier. So now where we're at on the diagram is in our presentation, we set up our ESG project in IDS for 2011, which corresponded to HUDville and HUDville's FY 2011 ESG allocation. We titled it ESG 2011 HUDville. We indicated the amount of the allocation and entered a project description that indicated the ESG activities we were going to fund, such as street outreach and rapid rehousing. So remember, as Chris has mentioned, that each IDS project has up to 6 associated activities, and these activities, as I mentioned earlier, correspond to the eligible ESG categories in the ESG interim regulation. Go to the next slide, please, and we'll look at this relationship. I'm not going to read this slide, but essentially it illustrates the ESG project activity structure and the naming convention. Each IDS activity on the left-hand side corresponds to an eligible component of ESG, which is on the right-hand side of the slide. Right-hand side of the slide. The language used in IDIS, which includes several other programs, is not always identical to the language used in the ESG interim regulation. After you set up your one project, remember you can create up to 6 activities. IDS does not allow you to set up more than one project or more than one each of these 6 activities. And as Chris mentioned, at the activity setup level, since you will only be setting up one project, you'll also want to train your staff who work in IDS, especially those that work at the activity level, even if they're just doing draws or even if they're just doing setup or even if they're just approving vouchers. You're going to need to train them about these new IDS activity categories so they'll understand, what they're doing. Next slide, please. So continuing with ESG IDS activity setup, the setup occurs on 2 screens in IDS. So we're going to look at both those screens in a minute. They're called the Add Activity screen and the Edit HESG Setup Detail screen. So to add a new activity in IDIS, ESG recipients will begin with the Add Activity screen. This screen is required for all 6 of the activities. Then there'll be a second screen that's required for 4 of the activities. Data collection and administration only require this first screen. Next slide.
Kevin, this is Kate.
So now let's take a look at the IDIS Add Activity screen for ESG. What we're seeing here is the top half of the screen, and once again we've circled some things that we're going to talk about. You'll want to ensure that when you enter information on this screen that you enter everything that's required and save your changes before you navigate away, or your work will be lost. So I'm going to ask that the person moving the slide stay on this screen because I'm going to talk using the next 2 slides, but I want to stay on this screen because I think it makes it easier so you can hear what I'm saying and see what's on the screen. And never fear, what I'm talking about will actually be on the next 2 slides, so you'll have them, so you don't have to take additional notes. So starting at the top of the screen here, select the desired year from the Program Year drop-down menu. Remember, this must match the same year as your ESG project. And in the example we've been using, this year should be 2011. It's important to then select the correct IDIS project ID and project title from a drop-down menu. The options listed in the drop-down menu will be limited by the program year you selected in the field above. However, it might be easy to select the wrong project, which will lead to confusion in your ESG reporting. So remember, since you only have one project per federal fiscal year, you'll use the project with that same fiscal year. So in this case, we'd select ESG 11 HUDville, which was the name of our project. Next, and this is the first thing you see circled, you'll want to enter an activity name using the proper naming convention. So like the ESG project naming convention, each activity name should begin with the term ESG followed by the 2-digit program year and then the activity category. So in the example we have here, we are using a street outreach activity. So we will name it ESG 11 Street Outreach. That way on the reports that print that citizens and continuums of care may be looking at, they can see what activity corresponds to the project for HUDville for 2011. And in the project description for 2011 HUDville, we mentioned we'd be doing street outreach, so then it makes sense that there'd be a street outreach activity under that project. So note that the naming convention includes the space between ESG 11 and the activity category. You're not going to have a monitoring finding, don't worry if you don't have a space, but you know, if you can make it easy to read, that's nice. The next thing I want you to look at is on the right-hand side, a little bit above is the grantee/PJ activity ID. Just like at the project level, there's a field here that's available just for your local use. It's nothing HUD requires, but you may have something for your financial records or something else that you want to enter a number there, and you're welcome to do so. Next, let's move down to the second and third circles. This is the HESG. It says activity, and then there it says program and activity category. So on this, you'll want to select the eligible activity category that corresponds with the activity name. And again, you do not want to use ESG. That's the second circle there. This is the HESG program path, so do not select an activity category from ESG because those use a completely different structure and convention than HESG. So you'll notice on HESG we've selected street outreach. One thing I forgot to mention earlier when I talked about the activity name, if your program year is different than the federal fiscal year, you can put your program year in parentheses after the activity name. So let's say HUDville's program year that they're using right now starts, you know, is 2012 now. So they would say ESG 11 Street Outreach, and then in parentheses they could put 2012. So the moral of this screen is really select HESG, not ESG. Make sure you're using the right activity name, and be sure you're associating the activity with the correct program year and IDS project. Okay, now I want us to go ahead to slide 31 because I just presented what's on 29 and 30. So on slide 31, now you see the bottom half of the add activity screen. This is the, you'll want to ensure again that you're filling it out appropriately. So for the environmental assessment, most ESG activities, as you probably know, are exempt or categorically excluded from environmental assessments. So you'd make the proper selection there. In the unlikely event a project would require an environmental assessment, you'd select underway, and then after it's complete, you go back in to revise the activity and select complete. Make sure to update the status to complete if you did select underway. Next, you see the circle, allow another organization to access this activity. Well, as Chris mentioned, only ESG recipients can access IDIS. Subrecipients, subordinate organizations, no one else can access IDIS for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program. Therefore, don't select this button. Then make sure to enter a brief activity description and click Save. If all the required fields were populated, the screen will reload with the new message that the activity's been saved at the top of the page. If, for some reason, you didn't have a required field answered on the screen, it will prompt you, and something will tell you to complete all the required fields. Now, just like with the project description, you want to pay attention here to what you're putting down. So, for example, project description might be something like trying to think of a good project description because I lost my notes, but this was, I believe, this is going to be a street outreach activity. So you could say, we're funding the Good Samaritan Shelter to do street outreach to the chronically homeless on Main Street. That would be a good activity description. Or if you're funding multiple organizations, within, the single activity, you could say, we're also funding the Good Samaritan Medical Outreach Center to engage people on the street and the homeless. So again, you want to make sure your activity description is appropriate so that people can understand what's being funded. If you participated in any of our other ESG webinars or read the ESG interim rule, you do know that there's more collaboration required between the continuum of care and ESG, and that the continuum of care now has to evaluate how ESG funds are being used. So I would expect that in April, when some new reports become available for the Emergency Solutions Grant Program at IDIS, that there'll probably be a report or two that continuums will be looking at just to see what the recipient is doing with its ESG fund. All right, next slide, please. You can keep going. Next slide, please. There's the description I was missing. Did I get it right? I think I was probably close. All right, one more slide, please. All right, so this now shows the top half of the second ESG screen. This is the one that you have to complete unless you're doing admin or HMIS/data collection. So for HMIS and admin, this won't appear. So on this screen, we've highlighted a couple of items. First, the performance objective and performance outcome, and the secondary activity categories. So we're going to take a look at that on the next slide. So please move one slide, please. All right, so on that previous screen, you saw that you have to select a performance objective and performance outcome. This slide shows you the options that can be selected. So wherever there's a check mark, you can select those. The background of that is that ESG recipients should continue to use the existing objective and outcome indicators that IDS has. We're not changing anything. These have always been in the system. These are indicators that were listed in the March 7th, 2006 Federal Register Notice of Outcome Performance Measurement System for Communities. So these are by notice. They haven't changed. What has changed is we have rapid rehousing in here now. So in this graphic, note that shelter and outreach share the same performance objective and outcome, and homeless prevention and rapid rehousing also share the same performance objective and outcome. Next slide. All right, the second part on that screen that we highlighted was secondary activity categories. So for the 4 IDS activity categories of street outreach, shelter, homeless prevention, and rapid rehousing, you'll want to select the secondary activity categories that you're funding. These secondary activity categories are what's known in the regulation as the eligible activities for ESG, and these will sound familiar to people. Unfortunately, with the IDS project and activity structure the way it is, we had to call these secondary activity categories in IDS, even though they're really the eligible activities in ESG. So let's say for shelter, we're funding just one shelter for the year, so we set up a shelter activity. We have 3 possible eligible activities that we can fund: renovation, rehab, essential services, and operations. We don't have to fund them all. So what we do is select what we were funding. So let's say we're just going to fund the operations for a shelter and some services. So we just check those 2 options. So only the options with the check marks are eligible. So this will help you stay in compliance. For instance, you wouldn't create a street outreach activity in IDS and be able to check renovation rehab, because obviously that's not an eligible activity for street outreach. There's a couple things to remember. For essential services, and that, excuse me, let me rephrase that. For street outreach, the only secondary activity that's eligible is essential services, so IDS will pre-select that for you. For the others, you will have choices, and you'll need to make sure that you select those. You can select more than one, like I gave in the shelter example. For a more detailed explanation of these ESG activity categories, like essential services, or especially some of the newer ones like housing, relocation, and stabilization/financial services, make sure you're consulting the ESG interim rule. Next slide, please. So now this slide shows the bottom half of the second ESG activity screen. What we have circled is the address field. Since the IDIS activity corresponds to an ESG component and not a project, so let's say this is rapid rehousing, there's not really an address for rapid rehousing because this isn't a project. You can leave that field blank. If you wish to fill in an address, I suggest you just fill in the address of the Department of HUDville or whatever department is carrying out, whatever department is the ESG recipient. I don't think I have to go any more on that, so let's go next slide, please. After saving your activity, you've now filled out the two screens. You'll return to the Edit Activity screen, which is very similar to what you saw on the initial Add Activity screen. However, now it will have additional fields, including activity status, activity completion date, and the initial funding date. You don't have to edit these fields for activity startup. We just wanted to show you that you're now going to be seeing this. Note that IDIS also inserts a Ready to Fund column if the HESG row also indicates yes. So in this case, it indicates that this HESG shelter activity is ready to be funded. That means that activity setup is complete. So you can jump in the air, shout hooray, you've now set up your first HESG activity. If it says no, then that means that they're missing some information and you'll need to go into edit activity and add any missing information. So now, Kate, I'm going to turn it over to you for the next polling question, please.
Thanks, Kevin. I sure hope everybody gets to jump up and down when they go through it just one time. So this next poll, please take a few seconds and read it. I also wanted to point out that a few people have asked the question of who is this webinar addressed to. Since the recipient is the only person who can enter the information into IDIS, of course, that is the first person that should be watching. But we do want to stress that it is highly encouraged that the recipient work with the COC and the local HMIS staff. So we welcome everyone on this webinar. Okay, not quite half voted yet. I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, we're up to 70%. The answer is false. And actually 53% said false and 47% said true. So let me go over this with you. During the activity setup process for ESG, no subrecipient organizations are allowed to be selected, and you are only allowed to create one activity per activity category per year. This is a significant change from the IDIS data collection requirements for the Emergency Shelter Grants Program and should be carefully considered and followed by all recipients. We will detail how designating subrecipient organizations will be done for ESG in the activity funding section ahead. I will now turn this back over to Chris. Chris, are you there?
Yep, sorry, I was talking on mute. Thank you, Kate. I wanted to mention to folks, thank you, Kate, and that we have not had a coordinated IDIS training like this before for ESG, and we will be running over 4:30. We probably have another half an hour of material, so please hang in there. We are now going to turn our focus to the creation of an administrative subfund. This is the only special funding process that exists for ESG. Please note that this is an intermediary step before funding and is only for the administration activity. The other activities are funded following a different method, which we'll talk about soon. Next slide. A subfund in IDIS is a portion of a grant that is earmarked for a specific use. It is identified by a fund type. IDIS only allows ESG recipients to set up a subfund of AD for program administration. An administration subfund is required for a recipient to commit administration funds for the administration activity. Recipients must set up a new administration subfund each year to fund and draw for each year's new administration activity. For the Emergency Shelter Grants Program, recipients could set up other types of subfunds. But for ESG only allows recipients to set up an administrative subfund, no other type. The ESG program currently caps expenditures on program administration activities at 7.5% of the total ESG grant. HUD distributed the FY 2011 ESG grant funds in two allocations. The amount available to recipients under the first allocation was 5%, and the amount available to recipients under the second was 7.5%. When calculating the amount of funds available to allocate to administrative costs, ESG recipients may use up to 7.5% of the entire amount, both first and second allocation. For example, if an ESG recipient's first FY 2011 allocation was $100,000 and the second was $500,000, the total available to allocate to administrative costs would be 7.5% of $150,000 or $11,250. To help recipients stay within the administrative cap, IDIS requires that recipients create an administrative subfund. Recipients can only commit funds to each year's subfund activities from that year's administration subfund. Recipients that did not create an AD subfund for the first allocation for FY 2011 should set one up immediately. Next slide. This is the Add Subfund screen, which recipients will use to create their AD subfund. You want to ensure that you enter all required information and to save your changes before navigating from this or any screen within IDIS. If you not click Save, your work will be lost. Remember that the subfund cannot exceed the maximum, which represents 7.5% of your ESG entitlement. In this case, you can see it's $4,496.85. Also, if you create an AD subfund for your first allocation, you will need to edit your subfund if you plan to use up to 7.5% for administration activity. When you go to edit the subfund, you will find your maximum has risen from 5% to 7.5%. Next slide. In the authorized amount for the subfund field, enter the amount budgeted for administration activities for the program year, a maximum of 7.5% of the total ESG grant. See the maximum row under the range for authorized amount header? The maximum amount will also prevent funding more than the total ESG funds for administration. Important note here. If a recipient does not fully expend administration funds for a program year, it must decommit the remaining balance of the subfund. Otherwise, these funds will be trapped in the subfund and cannot be used for other ESG activities. To decommit funds from the administration activity, first complete the administration activity or reduce the funds committed under the activity funding screen. Next, you would edit the subfund amount through the Search Subfund screen and reduce the amount to what you actually expended. This guidance can be found in an accompanied document to be published in the next week. Next slide. Next, we're going to turn our attention from the process used to fund the administration activity to the process for funding the other 5 activities within IDIS. Next slide. Before we discuss committing funds to an ESG activity and how to draw, we want to review the obligation and expenditure requirements for ESG recipients. While committing funds to an ESG activity in IDIS is not the same as obligating funds via an agreement with recipients, subrecipients, it is one way HUD and other entities, such as the Continuum of Care, will be able to gauge compliance. In addition, while expenditures of funds as documented by recipients does not usually occur on the same day ESG funds are drawn, HUD and others can use it as a general indication of timeliness. HUD will be monitoring IDIS draws to be sure they occur within 2 years of the signature of the grant agreement. This table reviews ESG obligation and expenditure requirements for metropolitan cities, urban counties, and territories that are ESG recipients. Within 180 days after the date that HUD signs the grant agreement, the recipient must obligate all of the grant amount, except the amount for administrative costs. This requirement is met by an agreement with or a letter of award requiring payment to a subrecipient, a procurement contract, or a written designation of a department within the government of the recipient to directly carry out an eligible activity. If the recipient is an urban county, this requirement may also be met with an agreement with or letter of award requiring payment to a member government, which has designated a department to directly carry out an eligible activity. Ideally, then all ESG funds are committed in IDIS within 180 days of the date on the grant agreement with HUD. Also, the recipient must pay each subrecipient for allowable costs within 30 days after receiving the subrecipient's complete payment request. This requirement also applies to each subrecipient that is a unit of general purpose local government. It is extremely important that both recipients and subrecipients understand this timeliness requirement. Also, the backup paperwork for each reimbursement should indicate which federal fiscal year the payment is for. This year, that would be 2011. Which activity category funds are being drawn from, shelter, homeless prevention, for example. And contracts should clearly delineate which activity categories a subrecipient is eligible to ask for reimbursement under. Specific eligible expenses are detailed in the HUD regulation, Part 576.101, starting on page 86, through Part 576.109, ending on page 112. All of the recipient's grants must be expended for eligible activity costs within 24 months or 2 years after the date HUD signs the grant agreement with the recipient. HUD is designing a new report to better monitor ESG commitments and draws. Next slide.
Chris, this is Kevin. I actually don't think you need to read the next slide. You can just mention that it applies to states, or I'll just mention that. And also, I've been sitting here thinking about the polling results from the last question, and that was at activity setup, do you select the subrecipient organization? And since it was a lot of people said true and a lot of people said false, people might have been confused about something I said earlier. So in this section under activity funding, this is where you will select the subrecipient or subrecipients that you'll be using ESG funds for. So I just wanted to make that clear that it does happen. It's just not until activity funding, not at activity setup.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. As Kevin mentioned, this slide is about what state recipients must do. And you'd find that the requirements are much the same, other than states have a different set of timelines where they select subrecipient organizations where they actually obligate funds, which adds up to 180 days that a local government would also have. Next slide. Once an activity is properly set up in IDIS, a recipient can commit funds through the activity funding stream. Note that there is a substantial change in funding ESG activities from the way this process worked for the Emergency Shelter Grants Program. Recipients must now further break down the funding for the activity to the organizations being funded to carry out those activities. This new process will allow HUD and the recipient to track commitments and expenditures down to the subrecipient level. In addition, recipients should be mindful that total funds committed to activities for a particular year should equal that year's grant amount in order to track the 2-year expenditure requirements. For each of the 6 activities that a recipient will undertake, indicate the total amount of funding allocated to that activity. Specify what portions of that funding is allocated to each subrecipient. To reconcile the total funds allocated to all subrecipients must sum to the amount allocated to each activity. The amounts allocated to all activities must equal the total allocation for the entire ESG year. Next slide. This is the Edit Activity Funding Stream. Notice that the fund type circled is EN, which stands for entitlement, and that is the amount of available funding minus the ESG grant amount that you have already created for your AD subfund. You should pay attention to the table listing the available funds. This table should only list one row of funding. That should be HESG, as you see circled here. Verify the amount available for funding is correct. The fund type for non-administration activities should be EN, and the fund type for administration should be AD. If the recipient has not yet created the administration subfund, the following message will appear. There are no funding sources available for this activity at this time. That is why we ask you to do the administration before the activity funding. Next slide. We will now focus on the new funding procedure that includes the select subrecipient organization requirement. First, enter the dollar amount in the funded amount field. If you want to change the amount, delete the current amount and type in a new correct amount. The dollar amount should match the funded amount for that activity for that subrecipient organization that you will select in the subrecipient field. Next, click the Change Organization button to select an existing subrecipient that is receiving funding from the recipient for this activity. If you do not find the organization you are funding, you will need to click the Add Subrecipient button to select the organization that is receiving funding from the recipient for this activity. A new screen will appear that allows you to enter the organization name, their city, DUNS number, an EIN and TIN number, and you are then presented with an option of selecting whether that organization is a carryout org or a subordinate. This is very important. Only use subordinate for ESG. The other option, carryout org, is not used for ESG and will be removed in future versions of IDIS. Once this information is entered, click Save, and you will be returned to the activity funding screen. Since this is a new process in IDIS, recipients should pay careful attention that each subrecipient organization is funded for the correct amount within each activity category. That means if you have a large provider that is funded for street outreach, shelter, and rapid rehousing, they would be selected as a subrecipient organization under the activity funding for each of those three categories. Recipients should spend extra time to ensure that the dollar amount selected for each subrecipient organization sum to the total amount of funds allocated to each specific activity. I will now hand the presentation back over to Kate for our next poll question. Kate?
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for staying with us. It's after 4:30, but we'll get through this quickly. Please read the next question. Which of the following must be done to completely fund your various ESG activities? Create an admin subfund, enter fund at the activity level, select subrecipient organizations, or all of the above. Okay, we're going to move a little quicker this time. The correct answer is D, and many of you chose that one, so that was good. You do need to create an admin subfund for your administration activity, and that can be funded up to 7.5%, so this is an increase. You also need to fund each activity at the activity level for the cumulative amount of funds you plan to use for that activity, whether that be shelter, street outreach, homeless prevention, rapid rehousing, or data collection. Also, during activity funding, you will be selecting the subrecipient organizations that will be funded under each activity. Okay, Kevin, it's your turn.
Okay, so next we're going to turn our attention away from the process used to fund activities, and now go back to drawing your ESG funds. Next slide, please. So we're going to describe how to use ESG funds in IDIS by drawing them by activity. The ESG recipient must draw down and expend funds from each year's grant not less than once during each quarter of the recipient's program year. This means that at least every 3 months, the recipient should be drawing ESG funds for at least one activity. And one of the reports that we plan to have in IDS will show us if you're drawing quarterly. HUD is requiring that drawdowns are categorized in each activity by the subrecipient that's actually carrying out the ESG activity. As Chris showed you earlier during activity funding, that's when you're selecting the subrecipients. So now recipients are required to separate drawdowns into each subrecipient's actual funded amount. For example, consider an overall drawdown of $10,000 that consists of payments to two different subrecipients, $7,500 to the Goodwill Outreach Program and $2,500 to the Outreach Case Management Program. These amounts will now be separately reported in the drawdown on the same IDS voucher for payment. This process is new and is described in detail in this next section. So remember that using IDS to draw funds is a two-step process. First, you create the drawdown voucher, and then you approve the drawdown voucher. Next slide, please. It's extremely important that both recipients and subrecipients understand the 30-day requirement that Chris went back over. Be sure that the paperwork for each reimbursement request indicates which federal fiscal year the payment is for and which activity category of funds are being drawn from: shelter, rapid rehousing, homeless prevention, etc. Contracts should clearly delineate which activity categories a subrecipient is eligible to ask for reimbursement under. So be sure you're looking at whatever contract agreements you're signing with subrecipients. Also, recipients should provide subrecipients with an IDS activity numbers that correspond with their funded activities, and this should be on the contract and any reimbursement. Specific eligible expenses for ESG are detailed in the HUD regulation part 576.101 through 576.109. So this regulation, at least this part, will become your very good friend if you're responsible for creating vouchers or approving vouchers. You'll want to be sure that all that backup documentation is available. All right, next slide, please. Here basically are the names of the 4 separate screens that comprise a complete voucher drawdown. We're not going to be going through each of these screens since this presentation isn't intended to be a basic IDS training, and drawing the vouchers really, creating a voucher and approving a voucher really isn't that different. And we're just going to focus on a couple new nuances for ESG. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the create drawdown by activity and subrecipient organization. The most important change to the drawdown process is, as I mentioned, you're creating drawdowns at the activity level but must select the subrecipient. So in this case, the screen shows it says available drawdown amounts for this activity and shows the recipient name, and it indicates a subrecipient. So that subrecipient will be, you'll need to select there and indicate then how much you're drawing down from that amount on the available to draw specifically for that subrecipient for that activity. So be sure that for each of these, you're listing the amount paid to each subrecipient for the work done under that activity. I know I've said it before, but you want to be sure all this is matches in case you're ever audited or monitored. So the amounts paid to the subrecipients must add up to the total amount that's requested for the draw to that activity. Next slide, please. So then for those of you that use IDS a lot, you know a drawdown must be approved by another IDS user. So once the draw voucher is completed, another user accesses IDS to approve the voucher. Per the HUD requirement, the process hasn't changed from the Emergency Shelter Grants Program, although now when the person reviewing the voucher reviews the voucher, it wants to look at things like the activity name, the program, does it say HESG, the grant year, is it the right grant year? You want to be sure that all the things we talked about previously that are on this voucher are correct. So I went through that quickly. I'm now going to turn it back over to Chris.
Thanks, Kevin. Now that all of our activities are funded and that we can now complete drawdowns, we'll turn our attention to completing our activities and using various ESG reports. You'll probably not be completing your activities at this point, but you will within the 2-year expenditure requirements set forth in the ESG regulation. Next slide. ESG recipients will not report beneficiary data or accomplishments in IDIS. HUD collects ESG accomplishment and beneficiary data information via HMIS at this point. This is a change from the Emergency Shelter Grants Program. Keep in mind that IDIS tracks the ESG 2-year expenditure deadline through an activity association with a project or program year. If it appears that not all funds will be expended for an activity associated with a specific plan year, before the 2-year deadline, funds should be deobligated and then reallocated to another activity associated with the same plan year that can be spent more efficiently. To close out an activity, go to Edit Activity, complete any required fields, and change the activity status to completed. After completing an IDS activity, any remaining funds not drawn will go back to the grant amount available to be committed. Recipients should be sure to recommit funds as soon as possible. Recipients should close out ESG activities once all funds are drawn or are reallocated to another activity within the same plan year. Thus, recipients will need to wait until all subrecipients undertaking a particular activity, for example, homeless prevention, have submitted all invoices prior to closing out that activity. For any unexpended administrative funds, remember to first deobligate funds from the administration subfund. Once deobligated from the subfund, funds can be committed to another non-administration activity. Next slide. Next slide. Very good. The complete ESG reporting capabilities are not present in the November 2011 IDIS release. Another release scheduled for the spring of 2012 will have more ESG-specific reporting capabilities. It should be noted that ESG reporting will be similar to HPRP reporting in that no program beneficiary data will be entered into IDIS. Financial management will be the primary IDIS reporting benefit for recipients. The reports available are the PRO1, the PRO2, the PRO5, PRO7, and PRO8. As I said, more specific ESG reporting will be available in the spring of 2012. Kevin?
All right, we're now in the home stretch. I'm going to talk about now some special circumstances that must be addressed this year since the FY 2011 ESG allocation was delivered in 2 separate allocations rather than one, which we normally do. Next slide, please. HUD provided fiscal year 2011 ESG funds to recipients in 2 allocations. So the FY 2011 second allocation incorporates changes necessary for consistency with the ESG regulation. So here's some things I want to highlight. Project setup in IDIS. In the project setup process, recipients will need to go back into the field's estimated amount, remember that Chris talked to you about over an hour ago, and change the amount in the HESG from the total for the first allocation to the total of the sum for the first and second allocation. Remember, you can only have one ESG project in IDIS per federal fiscal year. So since you're getting 2 allocations, you'll need to make sure the amount of the project that you put in reflects the totals of both the first and second allocation. Make sure that when you're doing that, you're not selecting subrecipient organizations and doing all those things Chris told you not to do. All right, now let's look up at activity setup. In the activity setup process, once you have your substantial amendment done, you'll be able to use the activity called rapid rehousing if you so choose. There's also data collection, HMIS available if you're choosing to fund HMIS through the ESG program. So know that those 2 are available. And then finally, Chris mentioned the administration subfund, which I won't repeat here. Just remember that if you want, you'll need to go back in and increase that subfund to 7.5% of both the first and second allocation if you choose to use that much for admin. Right, next slide, please. Activity funding. Be sure that you're allocating your second allocation of ESG funds to each activity that those funds will support. Those funds are in addition to the first allocation of funds. And be sure that when you go into activity funding, that's where you're selecting the subrecipient organizations. So if you're doing a draw for an activity that you set up during the first allocation, you're going to have to go back into activity funding and indicate that subrecipient organization there at activity funding, so IDS will let you then draw down for that activity. Finally, at drawdown, as we mentioned, recipients now have to identify the subrecipients receiving funds. So be sure that you're using that correctly and revising, as I just mentioned earlier. All right, next slide, please. Okay, just the last caution, be sure you're using the HESG path for anything allocated this year, first and second allocation. For anything from FY10 and before, which is for the Emergency Shelter Grant Program, be sure you're using the ESG path. Please don't mix them up. Be sure that if you have people going in and doing draws, they know which path to draw from. Be sure that if you have people going in and funding activities, they know to go into HESG for FY11, etc. Next slide, please. This is now where Kate gives us our last poll question.
Yes, the last one. So everyone please answer the question as quickly as possible. All ESG recipients will have to make changes to their IDIS project activities following the ESG regulations. True or false? Once again, I also want to thank people for staying with us, and we'll be finished in just a few minutes. Okay, let's show the results. The answer to the question is true. All recipients will need to make changes to their ESG project and various activities in order to comply with the rules and regulations that are, and the changes implemented within IDIS. So now is the time to figure out who will be making these changes and when. You should follow the HUD guidance that has been produced and is accessible on the HUD HRE at www.hudhre.info. So here, recipients are, surely y'all are familiar with this spot on HUD HRE. You can go there to download the document that will go along with this webinar, but also the ESG regs and various other ESG publications. If you can also submit questions to HUD and request technical assistance from the HUD HRE. Next slide, please. A number of resources are being posted on HUD HRE for your use. We are also asking people, though, as a first source, to contact the IDIS Technical Assistance Unit, who is available to help IDIS users understand the instructions for ESG. You can contact them Monday through Friday, 8:15 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The phone number is 1-877-483-8282, and their email is idis.help@hud.gov. The document using IDIS Online for the Emergency Solutions Grants Program will be updated and published this month to provide recipients more detailed step-by-step instructions on the new IDIS procedures detailed in this webinar. This document will expand on the procedures you learned here today, and you'll also have something that you can hold on to while you're trying to do this. If you have any questions that arise from the webinar and the IDIS Technical Assistance Unit can't help, please submit questions via the ESG HUD HRE Virtual Help Desk. Next slide. HUD is working to produce a number of user guides highlighting key changes in the new ESG regulations, and we will alert communities when these anticipated resources become available. In addition to the user guides, a range of additional resources will be provided on the HRE. We will alert communities when these resources become available. Next slide. There are a number of additional webinars related to Emergency Solutions Grants programs over the next few weeks. As usual, all of these webinars will be posted on the HRE website for convenient access. Next slide. We hope this presentation has provided you with the information you will need to successfully create the ESG project and activities within IDIS. You should also be able to create an administration subfund. And of course, it is very important that you know how to select subrecipient organizations during the activity funding and drawdown processes, as these are new and critical. We hope that the materials here have provided you with key pieces of information and that you are ready to learn more about many of the topics touched on here through our upcoming webinars and the materials to be posted soon on the HRE. Please take a few minutes to complete the online survey to let us know how well this webinar achieved its objectives. We will use this feedback to help improve future webinars. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.